Good afternoon. Welcome back. Geography 130, Lecture 6. I realized that the version of these slides which I posted, I had failed to update the date correctly, so I've done so here. Please change the year from 08 to 10 in your notes. Today we're going to talk about Malthus, an essay on the principle of population. I want to provide some of the intellectual and social context in which he wrote. I want to look at his principle of population. I want to talk a little bit about the poor laws which come up in his essay but are not elaborated very much, and the idea of redundant population. Before we get started, housekeeping matters. I don't really have that much to add. The wait list is still there, as you know. If you are on the wait list, please be in touch with your GSI about the situation. At this point, there's not that much that I can do, but we are obviously open to hearing your story and trying to do what we can do. Are there other questions or housekeeping matters anybody wants to raise? Yeah. The reader is available now. Yes. Nathan, you will look through it. It was all right, correct? Yes. The reader is available now at Copy Central. The one where I dropped it off is the one on Hearst, just across the street from Northgate. So basically Hearst, just a little bit west of Euclid. So if you want to get the reader, you can get it. It includes all the materials that are already available on DSpace. It does not include anything that isn't available on DSpace. So if you're comfortable just downloading the things, reading them off your computer screen, or printing them out and reading them on your own, you can do that. If you'd rather get a reader, you can get a reader. Okay? All right. Malthus. He starts discussing the question of the perfectibility of mankind. The great question is now at issue whether man shall henceforth start forwards with accelerated velocity towards illimitable and hitherto unconceived improvement, or be condemned to a perpetual oscillation between happiness and misery. These, I guess, are our choices. Have any of you ever taken a class on the perfectibility of mankind? Has it ever occurred to you to ponder the perfectibility of mankind? No? Why not? The first thing that we can say about Malthus is that in his time, this was not just something people thought about, this was a burning topic of debate. This was a big deal. This was a major topic in what was then known as natural philosophy, which these days we might consider to be some kind of combination between philosophy and political theory and the social sciences. Okay? He's writing at a time before there are the social sciences as we know them now, right? There isn't sociology, political science, economics, anthropology. These things don't exist yet. Nonetheless, there was a burning debate about the perfectibility of mankind, and this was a reflection of the Enlightenment, right? This is a period of time in which there are people, well, there's a lot of stuff going on, right? When is this? 1798 is when the first edition of the essay comes out. What are some of the things going on in the world in roughly that time period? Or rather, I should say, in Western Europe. Yeah. The Industrial Revolution. We're at a time of the very earliest beginnings, right? The steam engine is a recent invention, and its application to mining and industry is just beginning. What else? The French Revolution had just recently taken place, and it had been followed by the rise of Napoleon, which in turn saw a lengthy period of war, right? What else is going on? What's recently happened? Shortly before the French Revolution, the American Revolution. Okay? The United States has just recently fought a war with Britain. France gets involved a little bit. The U.S. emerges as an independent nation. In 1789, we get the Constitution, which, as we currently know it, right, which creates this republic, and it's based on these democratic principles, these Enlightenment values of liberty. The American Revolution helps to spark the French Revolution, or at least inspire the French Revolution, right? Principles of equality, democracy. All of this is that's sort of the political expression. These liberal ideals are the political expression of a larger Enlightenment belief in the perfectibility of mankind. There's this idea that we have really sort of opened into a new period of human history, and it will be characterized by prosperity, by democratic institutions, freedom, equality, and that this will move us in a way that humans have not previously seen, at least not in the experience of Western Europeans. And it's accompanied by tremendous technological breakthroughs, discoveries like the steam engine, the application of coal through the steam engine to do work and power factories, trains. It seems like we're suddenly just doing stuff that's never been done before, and it's really amazing. It's totally cool. It's amazing what we're doing. And we're getting better and better and better as humans, or as humanity. That's why this debate is such a big deal, right? Some people say the sky's the limit. We have found the right political system. We have found the right way to pursue knowledge through science. We have broken free from the shackles of old traditions and conventions and institutions, including, for instance, the church. We're no longer bound by religious creeds and doctrines. We are free thinkers. And so those folks identified with the Enlightenment are of the opinion that humankind can be perfected and that we are on the way. And you can see it, right? On the other hand, these kinds of revolutionary changes don't come without detractors. And there are other people who believe that this is all terribly frightening and fraught with deep, sinister problems. That this is a threat to humankind and civilization. These secularists, these free thinkers, these Enlightenment thinkers, they don't believe in God. They don't believe in the church. They're disruptive. These revolutionaries are overstepping their bounds and disrupting life as we know it. Politically, religiously, culturally, economically. This is a great culture clash of sorts. And this is the context in which Malthus is writing. So these are some of the aspects I've already touched on many of these. Theories of government, theories of rights and liberty, questions of wealth and labor and land and value, poverty and production. Malthus was the first professor of economics in the Western world. He sort of, in a sense, he didn't invent the field, but he sort of represents its institutionalization. There are a lot of ethical questions caught up in this about religion and morality and proper behavior. There are institutional issues regarding the church and state, education, revolution, constitutions, and there are big scientific questions afoot as well. Progress of knowledge of the natural world, the world's peoples and lands, geology, and so forth. This is a period of time in which, for instance, it's a point of great debate whether the Earth is 4,000 years old or not. The received wisdom from the church held that the Earth was about 4,000 years old. And there is growing evidence collected by geologists to suggest that that isn't just wrong, it's wrong by many, many, many orders of magnitude. And that the world, in fact, has Mike died again? No, not yet. Okay. That the world is actually, hundreds of millions of years old. And for devout believers in the church, this is heresy, right? This is questioning the existence of God. And it doesn't get any worse than that in their eyes. So these are some of the things that, this is the broader intellectual and political context in which this debate over the perfectibility of mankind took place. One of the key questions for scholars in relation to this question of the perfectibility of mankind had to do with the populousness of the ancient world. Why? Any idea? Who would possibly think that mattered in the context of this debate? Think about what kinds of things scholars of that time read. Think about how they, yes? Okay, fetishists might be putting it a little strongly, but the point is valid. There was, to the extent that you were a scholar educated in the finest institutions of education at that time and place, your curriculum was dominated by studies of antiquity, the classic period of Roman and Greek history, right? Why? I mean, you learned Latin, you learned Greek. A lot of the primary texts that were available to read in the Western tradition were in Latin or Greek. You learned Roman history. You debated the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. Classical Rome was considered the sort of previous high point of civilization, right? You traveled to Italy and Greece, and you visited the great monuments and colosseums and aqueducts and churches of the Roman period and the Greek period, and you studied their art and their sculpture and their architecture. This was what a higher education consisted in large part, right? And so in any debate about the perfectibility of mankind in the present time, any debate about whether we were really the highest point of civilization or not, it was natural to compare the present day with antiquity and ask, are we as good as the Romans were? Have we really surpassed them or not? And of course, this could then also tie in with studies of Christianity and the sacred texts of the Western tradition, which date to a similar time period, right? And so this becomes an important part of thinking about how we're doing and the perfectibility of mankind. And one of the ways you could think about whether we were doing better than the Romans was to ask about population. Are we more numerous than the Romans were? How many people lived in the classical periods of antiquity? If we're a larger number of people, that would be one way of saying that we're doing better, we're more prosperous. But it was not really clear how many people did live in the classical period. And for that matter, it wasn't really clear how many people were alive in the present day. This was an object of speculation as much as anything else. And there were a variety of efforts made over time to calculate the population of the world, and other efforts to calculate the population of the Roman period and compare them. So in 1685, Isaac Vossius had estimated that there were 500 million people in the world. Shortly before that, Giovanni Battista Riccioli had guessed it was more like 1 billion. But there was still debate about whether that number was greater, whichever number it was greater or less than the number in classical antiquity. So you have to put yourself in a frame of mind in which these types of issues, these are the kinds of ways that people are coming up with to think about this question of the perfectibility of mankind and thereby the sort of virtues or vices of Enlightenment thinking. Some of the predecessors to Malthus's essay, some of the efforts that preceded him are worth mentioning briefly here. Robert Wallace wrote the dissertation on the numbers of mankind in ancient and modern times in 1753. And he concluded that, in fact, the current population was smaller than the ancient one. And in explanation of this, he argued that this was actually due to our moral shortcomings, the errors and vices of mankind, and the defects of government and of education. And this was his way at the time of saying we need change. We, in fact, need to shed some of these old traditions because we aren't living up to, we are flawed. And we need change in order to aspire to a higher standard and, by extension, a larger population. He also wrote The Various Prospects of Mankind, Nature, and Providence in 1761. And here he kind of changed his tune. Having thought about how to improve mankind and correct some of those defects, thinking about ways to improve education or change education and government and so forth, he then asked himself, well, oops, what if we actually did these things? And he thought, oh no, darn, if we do this, it's going to lead to too many people. A perfect society would be one in which people flourished and prospered and had lots of children, and their children lived and grew up and had more children. And this would, in turn, entrain a problem of overpopulation. So we get this sort of dilemma. Maybe perfecting mankind actually has a downside that would be disastrous. The Marquis de Condorcet, a Frenchman, very much associated with French Enlightenment thinking, in 1793 wrote Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. And don't you wish these were the kinds of titles on the bestseller list today? It would be so uplifting to have people thinking about such grandiose topics, right? This is 1793, right? This is in the aftermath. In many ways, still in the midst of the French Revolution. And he argues that, in fact, perfectibility is possible. And he takes issue with Wallace's rather dismal fear scenario in which perfectibility leads to too many people. He says, no, these problems will solve themselves. because we'll be so much better, we'll be so much smarter, we'll have better institutions, and we will solve the problems. We will, basically, he was a kind of technological optimist, although perhaps he was thinking less about technology than he was about sort of human wisdom and virtue as a whole, right? That the institutions of society could keep up with whatever problems might be entrained by growth in population, and that what we need in typical Enlightenment spirit is free-thinking, rational, problem-solving determination, right? He thinks if we just get the right government in place, based on the right principles, and here he's thinking about getting rid of the king, right? He's thinking about putting in place a democratic government, that these are steps we can take that will lead us to this ongoing perfectibility, ever closer to some kind of perfect state. William Godwin, a Brit, weighs in with a book called Of Population. And this book actually follows Malthus. It's after Malthus. Actually, maybe the Wikipedia guys in the front row can give me the date for it. 1823 or something like that? Come on. Why so slow?
March 1756 to April.
No, not his life and death, his book. Of Population.
You don't have it. You can use that.
Oh, I have conquered Wikipedia. No. A rebuttal of Malthus, yes. Yes. I'm just looking for the date of the book. I'm trying to remember. I don't have it on the top of my head. It follows Malthus. It was a rebuttal of Malthus. Another example of the principle that longer arguments won't necessarily prevail. Yes? 1820. Okay. This is a very long book. And he was, determined to shred Malthus. The funny part is that, he wrote this very long book in response to, by this point, Malthus had revised the essay and made it longer and longer and longer and longer and longer. And just as Malthus's efforts to make his book longer didn't actually quiet his critics, Godwin's very long book didn't actually kill Malthusianism, right? He, in many places, openly makes fun of Malthus. But along the way, at one point, and he's doing this sort of sarcastically, he asks the question, well, how many people could the world support? And to come up with an estimate of this, he takes the example of China, which was well known to be a very densely populated place. And he estimated the amount of arable land there was in China. And then he estimated the population. And he calculated a density ratio. How many people could an acre of land support in China? And he came up with that ratio. And then he multiplied it by an estimate of how much habitable terrain there was in the world. He used 39 million square miles. And he concluded that therefore the world can hold 9 billion people. And I mention this both because it's a rather interesting early attempt to estimate such a number, right? This is not the very earliest such number, but it's among the earliest. And it would be interesting in some kind of weird way if it turned out that he was somehow right, right? Because this is about what we think we're going to get to by 2050, and we don't think it's going to increase much after that. Maybe 9 billion was correct, even though his method of arriving at this number was crude at best, right? But in mentioning it, I also want to stress that he was offering it in total jest. What he wanted you to conclude when you got that number was, Malthus is an idiot. Because 9 billion is so ludicrously high. I mean, we don't know how many people there are in the world right now, but we're pretty darn sure it's nowhere close to 9 billion, right? We think it might be 1 billion. And if the world can hold 9 billion and the present population is 1 billion, then Malthus is clearly just crying, crying wolf. There's no grounds for concern here. He later wrote an essay called Of Avarice and Profusion. And here he, somewhat like Wallace before, he somewhat backtracks from the Enlightenment creed. He runs through this. He thinks Wallace's pessimism was wrong, and he generally sides with Condorcet. But instead of emphasizing institutional reform, the abolition of feudalism, the abolition of kings, the institution of democratic representative government, those types of things, Godwin instead reduces it to an issue of individual morality. He sees this as a question of, are people virtuous or not? We need to think about individual behavior rather than social institutions. And he's really very much concerned about the question of whether a wealthy man should be miserly or charitable. What's your opinion? Should a wealthy man be miserly or charitable? It's easy for those of us who aren't wealthy to say charitable. I ask mainly, this is kind of a rhetorical question, but again, it's interesting that this should be the kind of question that frames the debate, right? Suddenly it's about what's the virtuous behavior for a wealthy man. And of course, it's a context in which basically all the wealthy people were men, right? Most of the people who were writing books and participating in these debates were men of some wealth. I mean, you weren't going to be somebody who got to write books for a living unless you were reasonably well off. And a lot of these people writing were, in fact, from very comfortable backgrounds. In many ways, this is a debate being waged among the elites of society, battling over whether to sort of perpetuate the system that has raised them to the level of elites, including institutions of feudalism and the church and that kind of thing, or whether the future lies in a whole different direction. But again, it's a battle or a debate being waged among elites. And so suddenly, or at least for Godwin, in this context, it's one thing to talk about abstract principles of government and so forth, but what about the actual behavior of individual people? Now, the reason this is even a question, well, here, let's read something here from him. It is a gross and ridiculous error to suppose that the rich pay for anything. There is no wealth in the world except this, the labor of man. What is misnamed wealth is merely a power vested in certain individuals by the institutions of society to compel others to labor for their benefit.